over time rather than what we're wanting, which is just an overnight change.
Because I think we were talking about cultivating the spirit of repentance and all that. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah. The idea of cultivation has everything to do with what do we do to make things grow. I'll be real basic here. I think I mentioned my wife's garden and all the wonderful surprises that are in that now, which I will never eat. But I think in us, the cultivating the spirit of repentance and confession, the kind of the precursor elements to being safe, because essentially I end up modeling what I desire in the relationship itself. Now, I can't make somebody do anything, but I certainly can. I think in a lot of cases, modeling the spirit of repentance instead of asking for forgiveness is one of those places that I display what being safe looks like. And as a general rule, the one thing I would remind you of is that I'm thinking on how many of my classes I talk about safe people. Probably half of them, which means that probably a tenth of students on this campus have been exposed to that concept. Maybe. I'm probably being over exaggerating. But so the whole idea of being safe and what that looks like and all that sort of stuff, most of the time, the challenge is people won't notice. But the issue isn't really that. The issue is like I said, what am I trying to cultivate here? Even when I say, I'm sorry, without providing an explanation of why, is another display of that. What I have found over the years is that, people really don't notice that at all. Sometimes perceptive people do who have been primed through other readings or other things. So, but I'm cultivating because I own my heart enough to, this is what I want the ground to look like. And so I will continue to cultivate it that way, whether or not anybody pays attention to it, either way. So, but I think making intentional efforts to do what I'm learning, even though it feels pretty awkward at the front end. I think for a lot of time, you all know, some of you have heard me say this before, but you know where the word sorry came from? It's a shortened version of the word sorrow. And we shortened it, sorrow over what? Over the fact that I have negatively impacted somebody else. And so we shorten it, and unfortunately we cheapen it, I think. Imagine for a minute, if you were trying to communicate to somebody how sorrowful you are over hurting them, disappointing them, whatever. I think the conversation probably would go very different, really. But I think we plant seeds in our relationships by relatively small things. Think about it. Jesus made that same example, right? A mustard seed. It's a very, very small seed that blossoms into a very big plant. I think the same thing is true in our relationships with repentance and forgiveness and the idea of reconciliation and all of those things. Those are small little seeds that I plant, I think. And all of that is part of cultivation. Because by the time you get to, if you're doing it in relationships where nobody really is noticing, when you get into a relationship when it really matters, you won't be thinking about it anymore. It's already been planted. And so the ground has been prepared, and you're already beginning to show the signs of harvest. And that's, that I know that that's still somewhat abstract, but I think generally our intentional behavioral choices in specific areas, particularly around conflict and around boundaries, All those two areas particularly, when I make intentional efforts to respect no as an answer, and when I recognize that I have hurt somebody, that I will confess and repent to them. Those are small seeds that are getting planted into relationships, and before too long, they become a natural part of my interaction with people. I can tell you that there are plenty of people that will notice if you say, I take full responsibility. What happened, I know it had an impact. It probably really made you disappointed, period. And we have so conditioned ourselves that the other person sometimes might say, yeah, but why? And the challenge, I think, for us to say is, if I go into the why, then we end up ignoring the fact that I'm owning what happened here. And so, and ironically, we do that with God too, right? I mean, things bad happen, and I stamp my feet and have a temper tantrum and say, why God, why? And the irony is even if he told me, it wouldn't matter. I'd still be mad. So I think the other side of that is how I anger somebody else's fury. And allowing them to be angry and hurt and disappointed. And that too is a cultivation factor, that I'm willing to suffer the consequences of my behavior. And what are those consequences? Somebody's disappointment, maybe somebody's distancing, somebody not engaging very much. Yeah, that's part of the consequences of, putting it bluntly in cultural terms, of being a jerk. And quite honestly, I think we can turn around and at some point in time, if the relationship continues, to thank them for being honest enough to let me see the consequences of my behavior. See, those are the dynamics, and shame makes that virtually impossible, because me owning what I do, I'm already in the mode of punishing myself. So shame is already part of the picture. If I live out grace within myself, then I can accept that I'm limited, I'm fallen, I will make mistakes, I will do stupid things, I will act like a jerk. This is not a newsflash. And people will probably get hurt. Okay, yes, I get that. I'm not being nonchalant about it. At the same time, grace says, one, I'm human. Two, let's create space for me to learn how to do things better. Now let's enact it. And that's the voice of grace, because it empowers us to do things. Shame chains us to the same thing. And so I think we don't do cultivation because it takes too long. And we're not real crazy about that. So like you said, I wanted to change by next week. So we make our objective list and check our progress and all that kind of jazz. It's interesting. My youngest is living with us. She's in nursing school, and she decided at some point to involve herself with a program called 75 Hard. You guys heard of this? And I mean, it was all I could do to stifle a laugh. Dads don't do that, apparently. And no, I didn't. I applauded her. It was great. But it ends up fitting into people's shame patterns. Because if you miss any one of the things that you're supposed to do, you start all over again. So it fits right into people's shame patterns, which is what my disdain for it is. It kind of markets itself as developing mental toughness and discipline. And yeah, I get it. I mean, surprise of all surprises, it's developed by a Navy SEAL. Where'd that come from? But we're like I said before, with shame, we're just marinating in it. It's just everywhere all the time. We think that way. We do everything. It's always there. It's fish and water kind of thing. So A cultivation fits into a grace frame. Raw willpower change fits into a shame thing. Because the minute I stop, then I'm a failure, I'm a loser, I can't do anything right or whatever. So it can be created and done by a great motivation, but the problem is the net effect ends up still toxifying us. So, long answer to a very short question, but
No, thank you.
yeah. Any other questions or anything? Yeah, Olivia. Don't do that. Just do it with force. She's doing this T-Rex thing. There, very good. We'll let you practice.
Okay, so let's say hypothetically.
I love hypotheticals.
I'm realizing this time around with the Safe People Talk that somebody who might be my roommate, best friend, somebody I really trust, might not necessarily be a safe person, hypothetically.
I have a hard time wrapping my head around all these hypotheticals.
And you're gonna hate me asking this, but I don't know how else to word it.
Yeah.
But how do I go about, how do I go about keeping that relationship, but backing into a space of, recognizing that that's not a safe person, without hurting that person and making them think that I'm distant, hypothetically.
So you want to set limits without consequences. Do I need to say anything else? So I want to be able to set limits. I want to be able to, but I don't want them to be offended or feel bad. The last I checked, you have no control over that.
But I don't want to tell them that I'm setting that boundary because that would.
So why have a boundary? You don't have to tell them, you can just live it.
But how do I live that without them knowing?
Yes, well there's this principle. No. There's this principle, it's called exposure. And the exposure with boundaries is, I show where my boundaries are. And sometimes I have to communicate where those boundaries are. Now you're hyperventilating. And they might not like it. Oh, fate worse than death. Okay. And?
But I feel bad.
Oh, so it comes full circle now. I'm afraid I will hurt them, they will hurt, and then I'll feel bad too. Which might tell us a little bit about what the motivation's about, right?
I see it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like what I say to Saxby, what goes around comes around. So, I mean, in all seriousness, I think in a lot of cases that is exactly what ties people up from having boundaries at all. Is that I want to be able to have boundaries, but I don't want anybody to get upset with me about them. And you can't have both. You really can't have both. Now, even if we drag it into, we haven't even started boundaries. Yeah, whatever. Even if you drag it into the physical world, and my neighbor doesn't like where my fence is, but my fence is to code and fits along my boundary lines. Sorry, I mean I got the proof for it. We can have a conversation about it. You can be frustrated about where the property line ended up. I mean, when we lived in Illinois, we lived in a portion of Wheaton called unincorporated Wheaton, and so taxes were less, and none of the houses on our block had fences. So the homeowners knew where their property line was. They kind of cited it or had a tree or something that told them that. But, we were fortunate we had neighbors on both sides that really didn't care where the property line was. But I've lived in places where the property owner really did care a lot. And so if my mower went kind of 2 inches over, they'd get sideways with me about being on their property. But that's a boundary line. Now in Colorado, fences everywhere because we're packed in, but the fence is convenient because it actually marks what I'm responsible for and what I'm not. We're not offending somebody because of where our fence is, but in the social world, emotional world, there are people in our lives who feel entitled to being in our yard, and we draw a line where our fence line is, and they don't like it. And some of the reason they don't like it is because they make the false assumption that they're entitled to be in there, and they're not. Which we will talk about. So we go from one easy subject to another, Olivia, which is just begging to be started. So hang on, or maybe I should say buckle up. Any other questions before we get started? Yeah.
How can you tell if someone who used to be a really unsafe person for you, how can you tell if it's the right time to give them another chance to be a safe person for you?
I think to some degree that it's assessing your own resources to go through that process again with the person. I mean, really, ultimately, the only way that I'm going to find that out is by entering back into relationship. That's really the only way I can find that out. So I'm going to have to do some assessment about what kind of emotional resources I judge myself to have to kind of wade through that again. Now, it's progressive, okay? I mean, when I enter a relationship that I've been kind of out of for a while, I've got some work to do to shed my preconceived notions and expectations about that person. If some changes are made, then I've got to make some adjustments to that. And that's harder than it sounds. The reality is that we have fairly static images in our head of our friends and stuff, because that helps us to kind of interact with the person. We've got the static kind of voice and what they tend to say and those kinds of things that are all connected together. When we go out of relationship, that image stays the same, and then when we get back into relationship, we have to make a comparison to who they are in real time versus who I thought they were before, and that's a little harder than it sounds, really. To some degree, you guys will all know this because that's the challenge your parents have after you've been in school for a while, is that their image of you is what you were when you left, and you come back and you're not the same person. And a lot of, yeah, and they're saying, who are you and where did you hide my kid? Versus, I've been exposed to all this stuff. I've been thinking about other things, and they're saying, no, I like the other one. Give me the other version back. and that's an example of kind of, you're kind of frozen in time a lot of times with your parents, and then when you leave and have experiences and make changes and kind of readjust ways of thinking and everything, and then you come back, where do they start? They start with the frozen image that they have, and parents vary in how loosely they hang on to that image. Some of them hang on really tightly because it's easier to relate to you in a static sort of way rather than you in a dynamic way. And kind of, you would say, well, it's exciting to hear new things happening with my kids and so forth. And yeah, that's kind of abstract. I think most parents are always anticipating this is just a look into the world of parents. They're always anticipating that you will get to the point that says, I don't need you anymore. And that is a fatal place for every parent to face. It really is. Because now suddenly, where's my identity? It's been tied up with my kids what they're doing and keeping up with everything. And ironically, you as kids are going to say, no, that's not it at all. But I need you in a different way. And some parents are going, I don't know how to do that. And so, I mean, all this stuff that we're talking about, like safe people or boundaries, equally applies within families, equally applies, within friendships and other things else. And, the class before you, I was talking about this in the context of a group, and you'll see this in your groups too. You will. So, does that make sense?
Yeah.
So, okay. I better be quick and pray here because I need all the help I can get. All right, let me pray. Father, thank you for this day. Thanks for loving us. Thanks for a break in the temperature. I pray that you'll guide our hearts into the places that you're waiting for us in the material that we're going through, and help us to look at our world graciously, to not only think about the other people in our worlds, but just ourselves and what changes maybe we can make. And even though it might be subtle, it is still important to make those kinds of changes. Help us to resist the shame messages in our own heads and hearts, and also just the ones that we hear around us. The more aware we become, help us to be gracious, because people are where we were, maybe. And so we can engage them anyway and identify shame when it shows, and be able to be resilient enough to manage it well. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay. So we finished off with forgiveness. I have a longer rant about forgiveness, but I won't do it now. The last point really on the safe people stuff is the whole idea of giving something back. Now this turns the attention away from saying, how do I be safe within myself? How do I be safe with my friends, etc.? And the one thing, let me loop back a second, because the false concept that we have particularly in Christian circles, that we just left talking about with forgiveness, is there is no such thing as self-forgiveness. That is an infinite loop you will never get out of, okay? And so generally, whenever I hear somebody say, well, I just need to forgive myself, depending on whether or not I have a strong enough relationship, I'll say, you can't, which is maybe too blunt. But I can't. I mean, it's a rigged jury if I'm trying to forgive myself. But maybe the wording, let's get it out of the wording of forgiveness and move it into the words of grace. I can live with myself with grace. I don't have to forgive myself to do that. I can live with myself in grace, and that's that's part of that movement. So when I get to a place of engaging other people in other relationships, understanding what I've been given, not only in a spiritual sense, but also in really a pretty remarkable relational sense. Because as we sensitize ourselves to grace, like we sensitize ourselves to shame, when I sensitize myself to grace, I actually see lots of evidence for it. I mean, my wife and I are in counseling, all right? We've taken some major hits with the pandemic and work and everything else, and we've gotten static in how we approach things to each other, and yet I am always reminded how much immersed in grace I am, that this lady would love me enough to stay with me for 42 years. That's a long haul, particularly how annoying I can be. I live with grace all the time. The minute I walk in that door and she greets me, it's grace. And see, suddenly my world opens up considerably in terms of how God provides grace to me. not just in the abstract, not just in my salvation, but in just the very small, unremarkable things that people do that are gracious. They don't have to do that. So understanding what I've been given is an important motivation for giving to others. Now, a lot of times we give to others in order to, and that's a fatal 3 words, in order to. Because now it's a trade, but I give to others because of what I've been given. And Jesus actually modeled that. He said, love others as I have loved you. So out of my love, my belovedness, I love others, rather than I love so that, or in order to accomplish something else. And that's, that's very much a part of even sensitizing ourselves to the people around us as to what their need signals are. Because even that conversation we had about needs versus neediness and all of that stuff, that's not something that people usually spend, sit out here in the carol and say, how you doing with your neediness today? They're not having that conversation. So what do though? They live that out with their internal narratives and other things that show up. So I can help others be sensitive and even give permission, and not that I have the ultimate power, but give the permission to have needs. It's okay to ask for needs to be met. And we need to encourage each other on that point, because it's a courageous thing to do. It's actually a very vulnerable thing to do, to ask somebody to meet my needs. We may not say it that way. We may say, hey, could you do something for me? Okay? The problem is in our culture, and certainly in a lot of our relationships, is that if I say, hey, could you do something for me to someone, they feel obligated to do it. And they really aren't, sometimes, not always, but sometimes they're not honest enough to say, no, I really can't right now. Okay, okay. I mean, that's every bit as gracious. I know that comes as a shock, saying no is gracious, but that's every bit as gracious as saying yes, because the honesty factor brings us closer together. And so there are people in your world that aren't real sensitive to their own need signals, and we can help identify that for them, and sometimes just give them permission. Hey, it's okay to want to need that or want that. So being able to ask for help, being there for people. You've heard me say before, people don't need your profundity, they just need your presence. That's what being there is. The more we own ourselves, the more we have to be present, really. So, and telling the truth, and that's the example I just gave you of saying yes or no. Now, in a lot of cases, it's never a yes or no. It's a yes with conditions or no with conditions. That's very different. So I'm not entirely saying just flatly no. I'm saying, yeah, I can do this, but I can't do that, I won't do that right now. Okay, okay. The problem is in our culture, we've conditioned each other in such a way that the minute we're requested of something, it's not a request at all. It's a demand, an expectation that we provide whatever is being requested. And then resentment grows because we don't feel like we have permission to say no, okay? And that percolates in the background in a lot of our relationships, I think. So, okay. Now, you've already asked your questions about safe people, so I'm not going to let you have any more. You can ask me later. We're going to talk about fences and boundaries. Now, I know a few of you guys have seen this video. Some of you have not, and I'll give you the background to it, just to kind of provide you with some context. The video I'm going to show you is actually from my teaching pastor days. I was a teaching pastor in a church plant in Thornton that was connected to a big church in Illinois, and we had a video production team that put stuff together for us. And I was doing a series on the Secret to Life series, and so I described kind of what I wanted to portray, and the production team got on it, And quite honestly, when I look what they produce, it was like, these guys have way too much time on their hands to do this. And whenever video production people have too much time on their hands, it really goes off the rails quickly. So what you have is what I oftentimes refer to as the poster child for boundary issues, okay? They clothe it in the story, a story that you recognize of one of Jesus's parables, but in a very, very humorous way. And so here we go. Hopefully my sound works.
Was made possible by a grant from the Fake British Accent Guild and viewers like you. Meet Greg Samaritan, a man like many men in this world, occasionally feeling the pressure of living up to the standards put upon him by his father and his father's father and so on. Or does it go deeper than that? We recently sat down with Greg and asked him about his heritage.
I am of the direct lineage of the Good Samaritan. Actually, my great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather was the Good Samaritan that Jesus talks about in the Bible. The story goes that a man was beaten and robbed by the side of the street and left to die. My great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather then came upon this man on the side of the road and decided to help him. Doing? I'm sorry, I can't help it. Just saw this kind of messy right here.
Being a good Samaritan at all times to all people, it turns out, can become quite taxing.
I'm basically a nice guy. I care about others. But I'd like a little time for myself.
That's good.
You know? Because every day I'm doing at least 4 or 5 good deeds when I could be enjoying my time other ways. I guess it's in my blood. I don't really have a choice. I find myself in situations where I need to help others and I oblige. I follow what my great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather did before me. No problem. No problem. I've got some time, and I'd love to help. So. Actually, you know what? She was before me. Go ahead. No, go ahead. Seriously, go ahead. Yeah, no problem. No problem. I don't even know what I want yet. If I could just have one day a week where I could be selfish and worry about me, have some me time, you know, and take the phone off the hook. Because people call me all the time wanting to... Hold on a second. Sorry, I've got to take this. Hello? Oh, hey. No, that's no problem. I'll be right there. It's my friend Tom, and he's moving today.
I decided it was time to challenge some of Greg's assumptions about his heritage.
Have you ever heard of a parable?
Sure.
It's a story that Jesus often told to make his point. And from what the Bible says, the Good Samaritan is a parable. It's a story.
What are you saying?
Well, it's a story that Jesus told. It's not something that actually happened in the Bible per se. Are you aware that that's true?
Hold on. Are you trying to tell me that my great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather is not a real person? Do you want to see my driver's license? It says Greg Samaritan. It's my last name.
In all this time, you could have been doing whatever you wanted. You just...
You know what? I choose choose to end this interview. This interview is over. Do you want some tea or anything? I have some cold cuts. I could make him a sandwich.
It wasn't easy for him to hear, but Greg chose to move on with his life and forever put away the assumption that he must, by blood, be a good Samaritan. Our film crew caught up with Greg a week later to follow his progress.
Greg, Mr. Sparrow.
No cameras.
Mr. Sparrow.
No cameras. Get that out of my
I
face.
just want to take a picture. Just a picture.
You'll see what I'm really like.
Welcome to Jericho.
Yeah, that's when the video team goes off the rails. Now, there are a number of things in there that I want to point out to you. One is he crossed boundaries just to be able to clean up somebody else's desk. Okay? Secondly, he didn't feel like he had a right to say no to anybody. And he put it in the context of course, his heritage. The funny thing about it is his name's actually Greg. And so, and you get an idea of how theatrical he can be. But but the other part of it is his reaction at the end. Because when we try to create an image of accessibility and get taken advantage of over time, resentment builds and then it starts showing up. And so oftentimes we want others to not pay attention or to see us in a particular way. That drives our efforts at boundary setting. And then when things don't work, we get upset. We get angry that people should know, or if they really cared, they would know that where my boundaries are. So in the physical world, I'll go quickly. I think most of you guys have heard this before, but in the physical world, fences, walls, moats, I don't know very many moats, but manicured lawns, hedges, etc. I mean, again, it's like I was talking about earlier. It's a way to set the boundary lines. It's a way to demarcate the boundary lines. And when I was, in most cases, particularly in Christian circles, when you start talking about boundaries, they transliterate it in their heads to walls. Nobody has learned this concept very much. I mean, maybe in the counseling world, those circles, maybe if somebody's been through counseling before, whatever that might be, everybody hears it as walls, when in fact, it probably is more akin to a chain link fence, because anything can pass through it. It just simply marks where the property line is, and generally, I can have a conversation with anybody over the chain link fence, as long as it doesn't have concertina wire at top of it. And some people like to equip their fences that way. But so 3 different things I want to bring to your attention. In the spiritual world, they define our soul. Proverbs 4:23, guard your heart with all diligence, for it is the wellspring of life, or the springs of life. What I think we have to develop further in terms of understanding that is what the writer of Proverbs is talking about, is the well of our soul, is out of that all things flow. Life flows, other things flow, and our job, in a sense, then, is to set a boundary around it and take care of that well. In a lot of cases, we get very much tempted by looking downstream from the well and all the things that come out of it, rather than paying attention to what's in the well itself. And that's a conversation for another time. But they define our soul. 3 different characteristics. One is me and not me, is how boundaries help us. As a matter of fact, this is entirely developmental. Children figure this out somewhere around the age of 2. And then all we hear is enough to make us just want to string them up. And that is me and mine. It's like the seagulls in Nemo. Mine. That's a 2-year-old. In order to say that, though, I have to recognize that I am separate from other people and I can possess things. And that's a remarkable cognitive developmental step. Annoying, granted, but it is recognizing that I am separate from another. And that's what me and mine is. The heart knows its own bitterness and no one shares its joys. How you experience the bitterness or how you experience the joy is really uniquely yours, because everything fits into that, and I can't possibly know it without asking. So me or not me, the second one is 2 and 4. And the key verse here is one that we have to kind of pay attention and spend a little time with. This verse is one that I refer to as the boulders and backpacks verse. And the reason that I say that is somewhat in regards to how confusing this looks on the surface, just looking at it straight up. Paul says, bear one another's burdens and thereby fulfill the law of Christ. Burdens when you look at the original language literally means boulder. Something so crushing, so big that no one can carry it alone. So when Paul calls us to bearing one another's burdens, that's being responsible for somebody else at that point in time, because they can't carry it themselves. That's something that they just simply can't do. The interesting thing about this is kind of the twist, because Paul actually refers to the law of Christ. Oftentimes we don't see those two things put together. But bearing one another's burdens and perceiving what the need is really very much a part of living a Christ-like life. And then he goes on to say, now start evaluating yourself. Evaluating yourself in terms of the things that you do or don't do, the things that you examine your own work, the things that are yours. And then suddenly 5 begins to make sense. Because 5 says, when it says, for each one will bear his own load, you can say, well, wait a minute, you just told me to bear somebody's burdens. What's the difference? The interesting thing is that even if you don't have any training in Greek at all, and you look at the Greek translated into English letters for load, instantaneously, I think most of you would recognize the word knapsack in Greek. So Paul's making this massive distinction between bearing one another's burdens, boulders that nobody can possibly carry, and load, whatever I carry around in my backpack that's uniquely mine for everyday life. It's not the level of a burden or a boulder, it's a level that I carry with me. I would hazard to guess that if we went through your backpack, it would be things unique to only you, unless you were being magnanimous and carrying somebody else's crap. So, and that's what the load idea is. It's knapsack, a backpack, essentially, because that's what we carry around, all sorts of stuff that we need for the day. A boulder is another thing. And so being responsible to somebody is being encouraging and supportive of people carrying their own load. So being responsible to, not for them, they can carry this themselves. So being responsible to somebody is allowing them to carry their own. Okay. And that's a key distinction in terms of understanding. So being responsible to somebody is encouraging them, empowering them to carry what's rightfully theirs, and perceiving that somebody has a boulder and I now become responsible for them because they can't possibly carry it alone. Okay? So me and not me, 2 and 4, and then lastly, keeping the good in and the bad out. We all need gates. Every fence has a gate. And that gate is the thing that allows entry. A fence is fairly worthless if it doesn't have a gate in it. So the thing to keep in mind is that if I think of the metaphor of my heart being a well, or my heart being the yard that I'm responsible for, and I have a fence around that yard, then I am responsible for the gate. I am the gatekeeper for that well or that yard. And who I let in is up to me. I'm the gatekeeper. Nobody else is the gatekeeper for my heart. And so I am the one that allows entry. Now, like I said a little bit ago when I was giving Olivia grief, is that in our world, we have people, sometimes family members, who think because of their status as family members, they are entitled to come in that gate without invitation. The older you get, the more responsibility shifts to you to handle your own gate. And so family members may or may not be given permission to come in that gate and have access to all the information that's necessary. Think of your room and the door in your room. We leave it open, and that's basically an open invitation for somebody to come in. But we shut it, and most of the time we recognize that when the door is shut, then I have to request entry. Right? Everybody does it. And that's the key here, is that even the well of my heart, or the yard of my heart, and the fence around it, I'm responsible for the gate and who can come in and who can't, or who's invited or who's not. And the biggest challenge, and we'll talk about this at another point in time, but I refer to it as circles of community. I mean, there are people that I've invited to come in and set up camp there, best friends, intimates. But there are people that you go farther out that really don't have access to that. And they can stand at the fence line and we can have a conversation, but they're not entitled to that information just because of their status. If anybody's entitled to it at all, they've proven their trustworthiness. That's the key point. So, examples, skin, obviously words, probably the most boundary-laden word in our vocabulary is the simple little word no that we all hate to hear and all hate to say. And truth, speaking the truth without love is a weapon, but speaking the truth in love creates a certain distance. It does. And then the idea of distance, emotional or geographical distance. I mean, sometimes we say that, right? I just need some space. Yeah. I need some space. And then time. Sometimes time allows me to get the distance I need to look back at whatever the item is or the relationship and get some new perspective about it. So there are lots of examples here of boundaries. Now, what I want to do is look at specific boundary problems. There are 4 different kinds, okay? The thing I want you to keep in mind and be reminded of, for those of you who've heard this before, is that these are not mutually exclusive. I can see people that have really good boundaries, like counselors have really good boundaries in their counseling life, and then get them in their intimate life, and they don't seem to manage that very well at all, okay? And that's, so the situation, even the relationship, oftentimes dictates kind of where they go from, or work from. So the first kind of profile, if you will, is somebody who is a compliant. They say yes. Greg would be a pretty good example of that. Say yes to the bad. In other words, everything that's asked of him, he said yes to. We would say they have very fuzzy and indistinct boundaries. Whatever anybody else's needs are my needs. And the tendency here in saying yes to everybody is to minimize the differences between us. In other words, I have needs different than you have needs. I need to attend to these needs, and sometimes they will come in conflict with what yours are. And so compliance, in a lot of cases, are driven by fear. Fear of abandonment, fear of being perceived as a failure, fear, you fill in the blank however you see fit. So fear. The other side of that, there's kind of a dark side to compliance. And the dark side to compliance is control. Because in a lot of cases, we say yes in order to manage other people's perceptions of us, which is by definition controlling. And so it's more a matter of covert control. In other words, how I think, not overt control, which we'll talk about in a minute here. Because overt control, we can pick those out a mile away. I mean, they dominate, they push through, they don't take no for an answer, all of that. But covert control is how I think about the world and the people that I relate to in it. And so I withhold information in order for them to respond the way I want them to. So it's not just providing information, it's also withholding certain information because of whatever the desired outcome is. And compliance tend to do that. Now there's a lot of these things that are all driven by control in a lot of ways. But so the second one is the avoidance. They say no even when somebody offers good to them. They oftentimes will say, I don't have it as bad as, and so therefore I don't have any reason to complain. What it does is it interferes with their ability to ask for help themselves. And so in their case, certainly boundaries are walls. They separate them from other people. They're being offered the help, and they're saying no to it. That's the example of the good that I'm talking about here. In a lot of cases, at least from my history, I used to very much be, still a little bit am, an avoidant. I grew up as an only kid. I grew up to be very self-sufficient. I prized my independence. And so if something needed to get done, I do it myself. I don't ask anybody else. And sometimes it never even occurs to me to ask somebody else. Now, I do a lot less of relativizing. I mean, we can say, the avoidant would say, look, they got a life. They've got a lot of stuff on their plate. They don't have time for this. I'm not going to ask them. And you know, the interesting thing about that is that thought train occurs in a lot of people. And they're showing avoidant characteristics. It doesn't make them an avoidant, even though these words are kind of phrased like a profile. But and ironically, you know, I have a lot of people do that to me. I have being a professor, and a lot of people know how many things I've got my fingers into, and they'll say, well, I didn't want to schedule an appointment because I know you're busy. And if I have enough standing with the person, I'll say, well, why don't you let me choose how I use my time? Because when people do that, they're stealing, not that I'm busting anybody, I'm not. I have nobody in mind. I gotta watch my eyes, because sooner or later somebody's gonna say, oh, he's looking at me. But they're stealing from that person the opportunity to choose for themselves. That's where I was heading. And it's not an intentional theft. I'm not saying that. But the net effect is that if I want to overcommit, leave me alone. I'll overcommit. It's up to me. I'll pay the consequences. And then maybe I'll come to my senses enough to say maybe no now and again. Okay? So, the avoidance. I have been the poster child for this for off and on for a long time. All right, now the controllers. All right. So controllers don't respect other people's boundaries. There are two different flavors of controllers. Overall, no is simply a challenge to overcome. So you say no, and they start giving you more and more reasons why you should say yes. And you know, if you really want to set somebody off step, you can say, so apparently my no is not enough. Now that may fire them up even more. That's possible, I suppose. But the reality is sometimes is that they don't want to do it, and they want somebody else to do it for them. And so they're making up reasons, if you will, for that. They project responsibility onto other people. And they find ways to make other people responsible for them. This is not the same as delegating responsibility. If you're leading a group that is focused on a particular task, that's not that. If even as a leader you ask somebody to do something, they say, no, I'd rather not, you still take no for an answer. You could always return with the question, so what would you rather do? Because doing something is not doing something is not necessarily in the job description here, since we have things to do. But that's a task thing. That's not necessarily a relational thing. So the two different flavors, the first one is aggressive controllers. The aggressive controllers, like I said, we can pick these guys out a mile away. They don't listen. They run over fences. They just simply disregard as if they didn't even hear the no. Sometimes when no is said, they escalate in an effort to intimidate the person into finally saying yes because they're so afraid. Okay, that's an aggressive controller. And sometimes it even escalates into physical abuse or verbal abuse. So for most of their time and most of their lives, they have no idea that people have boundaries, or they're even allowed to have boundaries. And so the challenge with people around these kinds of folks is kind of steeling ourselves against the assault that will come. Now, again, it may not be a physical assault. If it is a physical assault, we're talking about something very different. But the assault that comes is somebody starts leaning in on you to give them the answer that they desire. And I have to have some mechanism to be able to signal to them that I'm still going to say no. Now, you probably have gotten hit up by a telemarketer or something else on the phone. You know, you got duped into answering the phone call because it looked like a phone number you knew. And you say, they're anticipating your first no. They're already knowing that you're going to say no. And then they sweeten the deal, or they start adding pieces, or they do comparisons or anything else like that. and before too long, you know, you start either kind of wilting, or you just hang up, or I love the people that turn the tables on them and start trying to sell them something. I think that's hilarious. I'm sure there's a TikTok for that, but somebody that takes on a telemarketer. I don't watch it, I don't care. So aggressive controllers. The second one, the other flavor here, is manipulative controllers. And the interesting thing about it is that aggressive controllers are at least honest. I mean, they're at least very open and out front with you. It's very clear they're not taking no for an answer, and they will do everything to make it go the other way. Manipulative controllers, on the other hand, tend to, as the name implies, tend to be less honest. They're not trying to get you to change your opinion or change your answer. They're just trying to help you see things more clearly. And so they oftentimes frame it in the persuasion area. But ultimately, they cherry pick information, they cherry pick kind of the facts, and manipulate circumstances to point out how they can erode your determination, perhaps, to keep saying no. And like I said, in some of our relationships, we fall into patterns like this. Now, in a lot of cases, I think probably we run into something more like a manipulative controller than a overt aggressive controller. But the interesting thing about a lot of relationships is that the controllers, no matter which one, the controllers marrying a compliant is a match made in hell. It's perfect. And in a lot of cases, controllers seek out people that are compliant. And it's not intentionally seeking out, but they are attracted to them because, why? They can manipulate them. So the last one is the non-responsives, and they don't hear the needs of other people. They carry with them this kind of motto: if you don't like how you feel, change your feelings. Life's tough, just get over it. Let's keep going, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. They have a very critical spirit. You know, what's wrong with you that you can't get this done? So non-responsives, the irony is they're absorbed in their own needs and desires. And so they can't pay attention to anyone else's. And that's what makes it so that they don't see or hear the boundaries that people have, or the needs that people have too. If we go back to the safe people and talk about the irresponsibles, interestingly enough, the irresponsibles don't hear people's needs either. You know, they really are about perpetuating the delay, non-delay of gratification. But the non-responsives are of that group. Now, like I said before, when you're writing these down and thinking back over them and maybe heard them for the second or third time, these are not mutually exclusive categories. People can be a little bit of both. In my growing up years, my mom was very forceful. She was a manipulative controller, looking back on it. And as a kid, a lot of times we start as compliance because that's termed as obedience. And so I learned how to manage life that way, by being compliant and then doing what I wanted. And that pattern kept with me for a long time until I started recognizing the pattern and making some changes. So there's a few of these, one or two, that might stand out more prominently that you see yourself doing or you see in other people. It's a lot easier to diagnose everybody else. A lot easier. Now, you have people that have heard similar information as you. It might be a fun conversation to say, how do you see me? But that may be too vulnerable for most. That's okay, I understand that. But the thing that comes out of these, and why do I put this in here, not only to prepare you for the groups that you're going to be in, but remember, what does shame do? Shame keeps us stuck in the same patterns over and over and over again. And so when something like this comes to my attention, or I see it, or I understand, or somebody points it out to me, if I go to shame, I am already insulating myself from the feedback I desperately need to make the changes I say I want. And that's a key thing to keep in mind when we're looking at it and talking about it. And even because we'll pick this up and we really get into grace first, okay? And that will be next Tuesday. But if you wanted to chart it out as a table, you could do one of these: the people that can't say no, compliance; the people who can't hear no, okay? The avoidance, or the controllers, I mean. The people who can't say yes, the non-responsives, and the people who can't hear yes is the avoidance. Yeah.
What's an example of a manipulative control? I was just trying to picture.
Yeah.
It's like, I couldn't really think of.
Yeah. Well, we're looking at a long weekend. Watch the movie Enough. It's an interesting title. It just occurred to me. How'd that go? Jennifer Lopez is not my favorite actress, but it's a movie about domestic violence. And her husband is a classic picture of a manipulative controller. Very charismatic at the front end, making her feel very, very special. But the moment she started saying no, everything starts going south. So manipulative, or you were talking about manipulative controllers. Yeah, and manipulative controllers often are not recognized immediately, because a lot of it is hidden. It's how they're thinking about us. But if you're paying attention, it is like that example of, I notice when people are making choices for me. I'm just geared that way because I've been doing this for so long. And I'll point it out, if I have a decent relationship with a person. And that surfaces this controlling propensity of ours to keep the world a safe place. And so manipulative controllers don't always show right away. But when I say no, then it starts showing, because they'll get upset, or they'll retreat, or they'll pout, or they'll do any number of things. And that's manipulation, really. I mean, if I say no and somebody doesn't like it, they can say, I respect your no, but I really don't appreciate it. Okay, thanks. I'm sure they don't want to hear that either, but I mean, and so the manipulative controller is going to say, well, you're misguided, or you don't understand, or you don't know the circumstances, or whatever, and that's the way some of these things come out. So, and that's what I mean by, there's a lot of these characteristics that we all share at one point or another. You know, a lot of times you'll hear kids say they won't ask their parents for something because they know the parents are going to say no. Well, that's manipulation. And so it's those kinds of things that you begin to see. And so, and that's why it would be so hard to kind of profile the person, because more of it is contained in how they think about things rather than necessarily what they do. It shows up when they start bumping up against people's boundaries, though. So does that help any more?
Yeah.
Besides that, you came away with a movie. Anything else? Any other questions or anything? Okay, well, the money's waiting for you on Tuesday. We're going to start asking the question, what is so scandalous about grace? So, see you then.